today we're going to be talking about creating clothes/styles for your characters. Now, some of you, this is going to be easier than others because of the fact that if you're doing a contemporary story, so like contemporary meaning set in the modern day, that's going to be easy because you're going to be using modern day styles. However, I would still highly recommend learning how to describe clothes and styles because you don't want to go overboard unless you're writing a romance novel, in which case it's a lot of the descriptions are what they're wearing because you're staring at them because they're supposedly attractive. But if you're not writing a romance novel, that's not as much an issue. You can do a very basic description, but even a basic description is important because even if you're writing it for modern day now, if you want the story to be able to last, you need to be able to have it be well described so that way even 20 years from now people are like, oh yeah, totally, I know what that's about. Because there are lots of iconic things for every stylistic era, including clothes and hairstyles. So that's what I mean when I say style, is hairstyles included in that. So first we're going to talk about time periods. I don't know if that's big enough. We'll see when I check. This board is not nearly as good as the other board. I promise I will wash it and we'll see if it gets better. With various time periods. Oh, hold on. Nope. Not another human. Always gotta check and see if I need to open the door. Alright. With other time periods, it is good to think about what they would have actually worn in that time period, and if that would actually exist in that time period. So I would highly recommend Googling if you're not sure, and even if you are sure, I'd recommend Googling like this era of clothing, because of the fact that sometimes you're like, oh yeah, they totally had leather jackets at that point, and then you go to Google it and it's like, leather jackets weren't invented until whatever date they were invented, and then it's like, okay, so no. Scratch that. And especially because certain things were not appropriate for the time period. You generally, unless they were like some sort of scandalous human being, in the early times of Britain, and Renaissance era, like 1400s, most of the time girls would not wear miniskirts. That would be considered scandalous and not a thing. So generally, I would say if you're writing some sort of fantasy novel set in a Renaissance type time period, try to keep it very similar to the time period. So longer flowing dresses, lots of big poofy ball gowns, you know. However, if you want to create your own culture around clothes, that's totally fine. The reason why time periods matter is because even if you are creating your own culture, think about where your culture is in time. Because even if they have their own timeline, obviously if they have their own world, they're going to have their own timeline, they're still going to have different clothes for different reasons over different eras. And if you have clothes that don't quite fit for the typical era, like let's say they're about 1920s level of technology / timeline, that's great. But if you want to have them have different clothes than the 1920s, you got to make sure that your fantasy novel explains why that is. Like, for example, maybe in your universe, women wearing short skirts is a very normal thing and it isn't considered scandalous. So that means in the 1920s, having shorter dresses wouldn't be rebellious like it was in the actual 1920s. In your fantasy novel, this is normal. You got to make sure you explain that and describe that if you're going to do something like that. Or if you're going to keep it set in a certain time period, but fantasy and in your own realm, just make sure to explain why that works. Is there a religious significance behind it? If so, why is it like that? There are lots of clothing items that have religious significance. What nuns wear is very religiously significant. What preachers wear is religiously significant. Even regular clothing in the Renaissance era was religiously significant because it was primarily dominantly Christian and Catholic. And with those religions, it was very much believed that women should be fully covered from head to toe, and the ankles, oh my gosh, ankles, you know? And so as a result of that, it's important to remember that if you have any sort of religious significance in your stories and are like, well, they worship the goddess of nature or something like that, maybe your clothing styles will have a lot more leaves embroidered into their gowns, or will have a lot more flowers embroidered into their gowns, or maybe they look like flowers because they want to mimic nature, or who knows, maybe they have a lot of fur pelts because they believe in being hunters and huntresses, and that's part of their religion, and so as a result they have a lot of fur in their clothing. It's honestly up to you. There are dozens of things that you can do with this. That's why we're talking about it today. But it's very, very fun. Make sure that you apply usefulness, though, too. I notice this a lot, especially in science fiction and movies. There's a lot of issues with people being like, oh, well, this is more attractive, so let's do that. And it's like, but they wouldn't actually wear that because that's not useful. Clothing should be useful and attractive, not just attractive. And they'll be like, yes, let's just have them wear basically nothing and go into battle. And I'm like, that's a good way to get an arm chopped off. So we're going to talk about armor next, speaking of which. But point being that you need to make sure it has just as much usefulness as style. Yes, style is important. Yes, religious significance is important. But usefulness is also incredibly important. Why women used to wear aprons a lot more in a lot of time periods is because it was easier to gather eggs, easier to gather herbs, easier to gather all sorts of things. It had a usefulness. It wasn't just pretty. All right. Next, we're going to talk about armor because it is the number one thing that people in fantasy and sci-fi novels struggle with. Hello! Feel free to sit down. Pull up a chair anywhere. We have lots of stacks of chairs if you need to also. Yes, there are also chairs anywhere you'd like. Yeah, so aside from writing to your time period, if you're writing a historical fiction piece involving any sort of clothing, hello, yes, hi. Oh, okay. Sounds great. We also, I also wanted to talk about, because fantasy stories are very much a thing, armor. And science fiction this also applies to, because sometimes people do war in science fiction and whatnot. With accurately making armor, you can absolutely make your own cool fantasy armor. 100%. I would encourage it. Same thing with science fiction. The difference, though, is that you need to make sure that it is both useful and stylish. You need to consider things like, are all the vital bits covered? You know, we don't just have like like a tiny little vest and that's all they're wearing. Like, that's not going to do any good. You need to make sure that it covers all of the torso and preferably some of the legs and arms, unless they've got some sort of sci-fi craziness that makes it so their legs and arms are fine without armor, but that's up to you to figure that out. Generally, people want as much of their skin covered as possible. I know it's a huge thing in fantasy and sci-fi to be like, oh, but it looks cooler if they have, it's just some armor. And it's like, well, it also looks like they're an idiot because they're going to die. The second they walk out onto the battlefield, their arm's going to get chopped off and they're going to wish they had armor on their arms. So it's important to make sure all the vital bits are covered, and generally that means all of your body. Like, yes, sure, you can forego gloves, I guess, and you could forego a helmet, I suppose, but even then I would say helmet, pretty crucial, pretty important. The next thing you got to take in mind when you're doing armor is flexibility. Where are your joints? There are a lot of times where I see people who are like, this is great fantasy armor, and I'm like, how do they move? Because they'll have solid pieces of metal all the way down, and it's like, you have a joint there. If you have solid metal all the way down your arms, you're going to be fighting like this. That's not going to go so great. So you got to keep in mind, where does your body flex? Where does your body bend? Where would there be gaps in the armor so you can flex and bend and do all sorts of cool things? How much of armor do you want to be significant to style and intrigue and world building? And how much of it do you just want to make sure they stay not dead? The next thing that is important to consider is weight. A lot of people will also do cool armor where they're like, this armor looks awesome. And I'm like, yeah, it would also probably weigh 20 tons based on the sheer amount of metal you're using. And people are like, well, it's some sort of fancy new science fiction metal. And I'm like, okay, still gonna have to explain why. Why it's so light, why they would use it if it's that light, because generally that means it's gonna be easier to cut through. Like, just explain a few of those kinds of things if you're going to do super fancy armor that has very little purpose and much more glitz and glamour. The last thing that you're going to want to think of, the absolute last thing, is style. Yes, armor is stylistic. For example, samurai armor is very different from medieval European armor. Those were drastically different. And even with Mayans. Even with the Mayans in ancient times, they also had very different kinds of armor because they didn't really fight with a lot of metal. They fought with a lot of more obsidian swords and obsidian tipped arrows and things like that, and obsidian tipped spears. All their weapons generally had obsidian because that was their best thing at the time, which meant that their armor was actually a lot more of wooden and cotton, I believe it was, mingled together, because obsidian, the one problem with it is it gets caught in cotton because it gets caught on all the little jagged edges. And so as a result, it would actually stop it a lot better if you wove it super tight. Unfortunately, that didn't go so great when metal was brought into the equation. But nonetheless, the Europeans did some not so great things. But we're talking about armor, not necessarily the terrible history of the universe. History is sad and makes me sad, but that's okay. Moving past that. There are all sorts of different things you need to consider when creating armor. Another great thing to consider is scales. If you have any sort of creatures that are mermaids or dragons or lizards or any sort of things like that, do they even need armor? If so, how much armor? Because they have a natural scaling pattern. So where would they be wearing their armor? For example, mermaids don't really need armor on their tails. They might need a little bit because it depends on whether or not you interpret mermaid scales as being super soft like fish scales or super hard like dragon scales. If you determine them to be super hard, then they don't really need armor on their tail, right? That's fine. But if you determine them to be super soft like fish scales, you actually might need some armor on that tail. And if so, how is that going to work? Because they need to be bending and flexible. So how are you going to do that? There are all sorts of things to take into account when building armor and things like that. It's more complicated than people give it credit for, in my personal opinion. A lot of people are just like, put metal on their body. Go. And it's like, okay, maybe not so much. Especially because a lot of times people will be like I said, they put style first. And if you then look at the armor and then look at how would they not die in war, you'd say no, they would be dead. Because there's, like I said, too much going on. Too much style, not enough actual protection. All right, so next we're going to talk about meaning in clothing styles and armor styles and things like that. A great example of this is where you can make up your own meaning if you're doing fantasy or science fiction. A great example of this is Avatar: The Last Airbender, the animation. I don't know if the live action does this, but the animation I know for a fact does this. When they go to the Kyoshi Warriors, and with the Kyoshi Warriors, Sokka's talking to them and mocking them for, wearing all this makeup and all these fancy things, and he's kind of like, that's so silly. And then Suki explains, here's what the meaning of all of it is. These gold stripes represent this, and the green color represents this, and the makeup represents this, and she starts explaining all of the meaning. And then by the time she's done, he's like, that's actually really cool. So feel free, if you're going to do stylistic things with your armor, to give it meaning. Is there a certain color that they prefer, and does it have meaning? Is there certain flares that have meaning? Like if they have horns on their helmet, is it to emulate a god or a beast? That's important to know too. You can also determine different meanings of clothing style too, in personality. Clothes have a lot of meaning when it comes to personality. For example, nowadays, if someone was wearing a mini skirt, you'd probably just think, oh, cheerleader, kind of popular girl, right? However, if you were thinking like the 1920s, she would not only be considered a popular girl, but she'd be considered rebellious, Because in the 1920s, it was like, oh no, short skirts, how awful, gasp. And it was seen as a sign of rebellion to have short hair and short skirts. Whereas nowadays, it's kind of like, that's just a style. That's just another thing that we have. Other things can also depend on men and women's roles. If, they're more of a hunter-gatherer type, men are probably going to be wearing a lot more sturdy clothes, a lot more rough and tumble clothes, a lot more clothes that are easier to run in because of hunting. However, if the women are doing the hunting, they're probably going to be the ones wearing those kinds of things, right? So it also depends on how you have built your culture. Is it primarily female dominant, male dominant, or is there equal of both? How does that work for your culture? Creating a culture is very much about creating clothing. Clothing very much defines our culture, which is so funny because it didn't always have to. It was usually about like how it functioned in religious meaning before, and now it's become more like part of who we are gender-wise, which is very interesting to me, very fascinating. A great example of style changing, though, also is wigs. Wigs used to be considered very fashionable for men, along with makeup. Just powder on your face, the big fat white wig, There was a lot more pomp and circumstance back then, so it was like, oh, I'm gorgeous because I'm wearing a wig and white powder. And nowadays we'd look at someone and go, are you okay? If they were wearing a wig and lots of white powder on their face, we'd be like, all right, weirdo. Not sure how to feel about you. We'd kind of stare at them funny. But it was more important back then because back then it was seen as a sign of status. It was seen as a sign of, oh, I'm so much better than thee because I can afford a wig and I can make my skin look super white because looking white is, fancy because Europeans are weird. And so as a result, that was very much a popular thing back then. But that doesn't mean it is now, but that's because of the circumstances. Also, like I said, religious circumstances and roles in the time period are very much important to determining how clothes are going to function. If you're ever worried also about time period stuff, I would say definitely look up the time period and what it looks like. One of my favorite things to do if I'm writing a historical piece is to just Google what would fill in the blank role, so like if they're an engineer or a pirate or etc., where during this time period. And yeah, you can have a little fun with it, you can spice it up, add a little flair that's maybe unrealistic for the time period, sure. But I would generally say try to stick to the time period if you're writing anything even kind of historical, even if it's historical fantasy, because it's nice to be able to have it feel realistic to the time period. And it's a lot of fun, too. You'd be surprised. I honestly thought that I was, not that into the Regency era stuff. It was kind of boring to me. But the clothing was actually really fascinating. And a lot of the styles that they wear are actually really cool. And I'm like, wow, the clothing was cool. I'm not so sure about the time period. The time period was kind of weird, but the clothing was cool. You can find interesting ways, like I said, to describe things, too. So that's the last thing we're going to talk about is description. So, with description, if you are writing a romance novel, then it's much more acceptable to give every single little detail. Because as I said, if the lady or the man or whoever is staring at said significant other, they might describe them, as having a beautiful flowing blue dress and beautiful sparkling white shoes. Whereas if you're in a regular novel, you might just say, the gorgeous blue dress flowed down to the ground. Simple. Leave it at that. Nothing too complicated. I would only go into greater detail if it is supposed to be a romantic scene, because then it's seen as admiring. They're noticing the clothes, but they're more noticing how the beautiful person wears the clothes, However, if you're not writing a romance novel, I would generally say keep it short. especially if it's a contemporary novel, because most people already know what these styles look like. But like I said, if you want the novel to continue to be read for years and years, you're going to need descriptions, because not everyone's going to remember what the style was in 2010 or whatever year you're writing it in. So I would highly recommend, even if it's just something small, like they pulled on a gray hoodie and some jean shorts. There you go. Now you have a basic description of what they're wearing, and you didn't go into too much detail. However, you didn't also say, and they were wearing their regular stuff. What does that mean? You gotta make sure that you describe at least a teeny bit about clothes. I would say for every character that you introduce, at least give us one detail about their clothes. Even just one. Like if they're wearing all pink, tell us they're wearing all pink. You don't have to tell us what they're wearing, just they're wearing all pink. That works. Or if they're very much a preppy cheerleader, you can say they're wearing a cheerleader outfit. That works. Or if they are a goth or emo kid, you can say they're wearing all black and a lot of makeup. That also works. You don't have to go super in detail when you're doing a much more modern novel, but at the same time, you don't want to have no detail. No detail is bad. Too much detail is bad unless it's a romance novel, in which case go nuts. A romance novel breaks all the rules in a lot of description settings. All right, that is all I have to say today about talking about clothes and armor and all those kinds of things. If you guys have questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will just turn off the video. No questions? Cool. Question? No? Okay, cool. Just like to make sure. All right, cool. I will just turn it off then. Reminder that the story contest, the entries are due by the end of May. Try to get them in before the last day of May, because they're due 15 minutes before we close on the last day of May. So as a result, if you're late, we won't take it. Unless you call ahead of time and say, hey, I'm going to be just barely before 6, because we close at 6 the last day of May. So you got to make sure that you're there before 6, well before 6. And then you let me know ahead of time if you're not going to be able to get there on time. And I will accept it if it is a couple minutes late, but I will not accept it if it's a whole day late. So you got to make sure you get it in. I am very excited for this, and I'm very much hoping that it will all go well. I'm so excited for it. So please, just as a reminder, grab your sheets out there if you're interested, and please turn them in by the end of May.